Episode 7, Kolie Moore. Welcome to the Oxidative Potential Podcast, where we discuss all things sports science and performance. I'm your host, Matthew DeRoche, and with me is my fellow co-host, Phil Batterson. Enjoy. Hey folks, today on this episode, it's going to be a shared episode between myself and Kolie Moore. And Kolie is from the Empirical Cycling Podcast. It's my favorite exercise physiology podcast. It's also a cycling podcast, but he does a very diligent job in leaving no stone unturned when it comes to exercise phys and also coaching, just making what is out there in the research applicable or kind of shedding light where it's not applicable. And this is also why I've reached out to Kolie for a consultation, because I think he does a great job at taking everything out there, whittling it down, and seeing if it really holds up, whether that's in practice or even just in the research itself. Like, a lot of things can be misconstrued. Reach out to him. You can find him on his website, which I'll link in the show notes. Now, this conversation was all over the place. We talked about cycling. We talked about weight cutting, its applications or lack of applications for cycling, and also MMA and some of the crazy practices that go on there. We talked about pacing. We talked about the long-term strategy. We talked about a ton of stuff, coaching. So the conversation was all over the place. Unfortunately, I didn't ask as many questions as I wanted to. And hopefully in the future, when we do another podcast again, I'll get more questions in there, because I really like hearing Kolie's insight on things. And, it's everything he says, I take note of. He's got a great background in biology. He's very well read in biochemistry, and also exercise physiology. Like he's a great resource to have. I really appreciate the stuff that he puts out. So hope you guys enjoy this conversation. Can't wait to do another one of these with Kolie, and check out his stuff. I'll leave all of his stuff in the show notes. His Instagram is absolutely hilarious. It's something I wish I could, do. Just make light of all the stuff that's out there. It's just, he does it in such a funny way. But yeah, I'll leave his Instagram, his website for coaching and consultation inquiries, and also his podcast in the show notes. So enjoy, folks.
Your background's MMA, and so, at what point did you decide to stop doing MMA, and what was your thought process there? Because
it's funny, and this is actually why.
Was your body breaking down too, or were you just sick of forgetting math and getting knocked in the head? Or
well, it's actually a little bit of both. My body was consistently breaking down through, you're throwing your limbs at each other at high velocities and bone on bone and stuff like that. Over time, yeah, you do accumulate injuries, and you're always going into fights injured, right? Some people are going into fights with broken limbs, right? Crazy stuff.
Are they?
Just to get 100%. I've seen people go into fights with broken arms. I've seen people go into fights with broken hands. But the real problem for me was the neurological consequences, because I had started looking into concussions before I even really got into MMA, right? Because I'd played a lot of other sports, hockey, rugby, all these different things, even powerlifting.
Yeah, the Canadian sports, yeah.
Exactly. Yeah. So I understood that there is a neurological consequences to subconcussive blows. Even though I wasn't getting, flatline grade 3 concussion, I knew that these accumulated traumas was going to rear its head someday. And I think that the disconnect there for a lot of fighters is because it takes 10, 15 years for the symptoms to actually show up. there the dissonance is such it's such a large gap, right? So for me, I knew that they're already coming out with, you know, technology and things were already starting to detect it much earlier. And I seen, oh yeah, even though I'm not feeling symptoms, I know this is going to be a problem and I have to deal with. And I just, when you're going into a training camp and you're going to put everything into it, if there's a little bit of that in your head where I'm like, oh, if I get knocked out, oh, if I, there's a little bit too much resistance because I try and explain this, you know, to other athletes as well. Training for an event is extremely stressful in itself, right? Like I'm sure you understand when you're training for this peak event, it's a huge thing. You know, the amount of effort that goes into managing just the logistics of dealing with your family, dealing with work, just that itself.
Yeah.
But then you have this thing in the back of your head where you're like, there's one individual out there that is training specifically for me, you know, to kick my head in. And he's trying to figure out every weakness I have, every, you know, deficiency I have, and he's going to try and exploit that and knock my
Well,
head
you're
off
trying
in
to do
front
the
of
same to
thousands.
him.
Exactly. So you're sitting with that stress in the background, and that's honestly, I think, one of the reasons why fighters age so dramatically is because of that low level stress.
It's the out of the ring stress,
Exactly.
the constant wear.
Yeah.
Yeah. Well, it's, you know, that sounds like that's like World War One kind of battles, you know, just like drawn out forever, and then just one day, like, you know, there's a show with your name on it. But if you make it through, it's like, you know, what do they call it back in the day? Shell shock, because I thought it
Yeah,
was from
shell shock, PTSD.
the shelling.
Yeah.
You know, but you know, MMA's no joke. I did taekwondo
That's
for
right.
about
Yeah.
10 years.
Yeah.
I stopped right when I was like a freshman in college around like 2000, 2001. And I got my fair share of knockouts. And I remember after every one, because this was like the, you know, mid late 90s. And I was actually selected for some pretty high level international teams, and I was never allowed to go because the places we were going to go, my parents were like, "Oh, you're going where? No, you're not. You're going where in India? No, no.
Yeah.
Have you
Yeah.
heard about the fighting that's going on there?" I'm like, "It's on
Yeah.
the other side of the country. It's fine." And they're like, "No, you are not going."
Yeah.
But there was no conception of that kind of stuff. And I remember getting knocked out in a tournament once, but I got up fast enough that they didn't like call the fight off. I just like stood there waiting for the clock to run out. And the guy was just standing there like, I won, but you feeling okay?
Yeah. Yeah. And those things, like looking back at it now, you don't notice every time I've suffered like, you know, fairly dramatic subconcussive blows to the point where I'm probably at a grade 1 concussion. There's
Like
these
constantly?
little, yeah, there's these little changes. And we know that through concussion testing now that individuals plenty of times don't go back to baseline. Like, for example, like my partner, she had a fairly serious concussion that I honestly believe that she's never gone back to baseline since then. There's certain things with her coordination, her balance, vagal tone, like autonomic nervous system functioning. I think there's
Yeah.
specific things that, you know, and especially athletes don't want to add all these little things to correct some of these problems in the first place. So the process was just too much to me. We're having a family. I'm not going to, for the little bit of glory, right? It's not, and I love the competition. I was in it for the competition, but, you know, I could still go out and roll and I can still go out and play spar and do those things if I really want to. So I
Yeah.
decided,
Well, I mean,
yeah.
it sounds a lot like a lot of older criterium racers, and actually a lot of clients I've had who start in their 30s and 40s, who have a wife or expecting kids or have kids. A lot of them they will like race and just not even contest any sprints. They enjoy the speed, they enjoy that aspect of the competition, but they're not willing to risk, you know, themselves, you know, or their family or whatever. And so I think that that at the very least is a really good parallel between fighting and bike racing. Is that, you know, the level of risk that you're willing to tolerate. And you know, bike racing it's you know, in some ways it's a sport about managing risk. And you know, it's like for me, my my best, like, I was never able to like get to the line with like just 3 other people or something like that. Like I had to go there with like 30 other people in a big bunch sprint. So I was always like, it's one of those things where, just you just roll the dice straight up. I don't have good odds of ever winning a bike race like that, but it's like you and one other guy, and it's like 50-50.
Yeah.
Like who's going to come out of there able to, see straight and walk and,
Yeah.
whatever it is.
That's a really good point on risk, hazard, managing these things. It's funny because this is a huge field. Like if you get into mountaineering or skydiving, risk management is like a huge portion of study. Like they put out these accident reports every year. You can go online and read them. And the FAA does the same thing for skydiving. So you can go out and read these accident reports, the thought process of the individuals involved, if they could glean that, if someone survived. And that's a thing that I think is kind of lost in other sports, whether it's through the training process or whatever it is understanding what you're willing to sacrifice. So for example, when I go out and climb with an individual, I'll be very clear in relaying to them the risks of doing it. Yeah, the risk might be low or the risk might be high depending on what we're climbing. But unless you're willing to have a piece rip out and fall and slam from 60 feet onto the deck, we shouldn't engage in this if you're not willing to risk that. And it sounds super dramatic and stuff like that, but I've always known that people, whenever shit hits the fan, the people that weren't willing to accept that risk end up the most, absolutely dismantled from the event, right?
Mm-hmm.
They cannot cope with the consequences afterwards because they weren't ready to take those risks in the first place.
Right. No mitigation strategy.
Exactly.
Well, actually thinking about concussions, I was actually surprised because I listened to an interview with Dale Earnhardt Jr., who was talking about his concussions, and I didn't know how PT-able concussions can be for some people, but also for some people there's just no coming back. And what's the state of the stuff at this point with concussions? Like what kind of doctors can you see for that kind of stuff? And there are people that specialize in it, right? But they're few and far between, is my understanding.
Few. Yeah. For example, like even where I live now, I've seen a concussion clinic open up in the last few years, I believe. But if you go in and kind of look at what they're doing, or if you look at most of the concussion clinics around, they're at a very, very basic level of operation. So they're doing some basic coordination testing. They're doing some basic, cognitive response. But a lot of things that are going to be the problem down the road aren't necessarily going to show up in those. For example, we know that gait is a huge parameter of understanding future, right? But a lot of people aren't even into that field yet, or autonomic function, like we were talking about earlier. Mm-hmm. A lot of people don't have the ability to understand those well or test them well. So I think there's just, it's good that they're getting better, but I honestly don't believe that if you can get back to doing a certain balance test on your foot or, pressing the numbers at a certain given time, that means that, hey, you're back to baseline. I don't believe that. It's funny because I'm always reading some of these random Russian journals, and they've been kind of ahead of the science on this for a long time, right? They've actually got some pharmacology. Yeah, they've got quite a bit of pharmacology out there that is used for traumatic brain injury that's shown some insane results, like absolutely insane results, but also their protocols and stuff like that. And it's just, there's a little bit of a disconnect there. Like Western kind of science is getting up to it, but they're still kind of grabbing the bull by the horns a little bit too much rather than trying to finesse their way into understanding the underlying importance of, anyways.
Yeah. Actually, well, I wanted to ask you specifically, because you come from MMA, what kind of stuff, I mean, it's probably still going on, a lot of it. What kind of stuff did you do in MMA back in the day to like train or cut weight that you know for a fact now is absolute bullshit?
Um, there's a ton of stuff, man. Like, I don't know where to start with this. Actually, like, I think the weight cutting thing. I just had a conversation. I went back to my buddy's gym yesterday for the first time in years, and they were talking about weight cutting, and I think there's a lot of misguided information going on there with like rehydration. Oh, I got an IV, I'm fine. It's like, your brain is going to take several weeks to rehydrate after a cut that dramatic, especially, most guys are doing 15 to 20 pounds in one day. So 24 hours of water cut in one day. I'll give you an example of a weight cut that I did, right? I was at 210 pounds. I got a call for a fight 6 weeks later at 160 pounds. So that's, 55 pounds roughly, whatever, 55, 60 pounds. Sorry, 50 pounds. Yeah, 50 pounds from 210. So that's 50 pounds in a month and a half, right? The damage that I did to my kidneys, like, it's funny because people don't think about these things. Like when you get stage 1 chronic kidney disease when you're 45 because you wanted to get a slight advantage in a few fights, is that worth the trade-off? Because with MMA, we're seeing these really dramatic like protocols going on that we don't even really know the long-term effects of that, because boxing is not as extreme in terms of weight cutting as MMA is. And some of the methods that they use, like for example, when I was on, I did this show back in the day for MMA, and some guy dumped alcohol in the bath because he said it's going to dry your skin out better. I ended up taking a seizure 24 hours before a fight and still went out there and fought. I've seen this happen to guys before too, taking seizures during weight cuts. It's just, there's so much dogma from wrestling, all these other sports that have kind of worked their way in, and it was all built off of nothing. It was all built off no science. So at the end of it, I started really getting good at understanding rehydration, glycerol, some of these things that are hyperhydration, understanding how much weight is adequate to cut and how much can I get away with without, dehydrating my spinal fluid, for example. But also just the training too, like, and this carries over to any sport that I've ever heard. You get into sports and people just say, oh yeah, you got to work on your pedal stroke, or you got to, work on your gait, or for training, it was always get a good jab. But what does that actually mean? Can you explain to me as a coach, what does getting a good jab actually mean at the neurological level, at the muscular level, right?
Yeah. Well, because I know how I would describe it and I know how I would want to quantify it.
Mm-hmm.
But the question is, how do you, well, a lot of people probably don't have the equipment to measure that kind of thing. Like I would want high-speed camera. I would want to look at, speed, like maximum speed. I would want to look at force. I would also want to look at like isometric force, or like what can you bench press, that kind of stuff.
Yeah.
And it's one of those things where like that's what I would want to see. But I think the weight thing in MMA is it's a lot more extreme than in cycling. But in cycling, I feel like it's a lot more chronic. Like in MMA,
Yeah, it is.
it's like really acute. Like you're going to cut 50 pounds in 6 weeks, or in cycling, you're just going to be perpetually underweight, and you're never going to quite have the right amount of power. And that's actually another thing that's, I think, is interesting between cycling and MMA is like in MMA, you don't have anything like a power meter where you can go, oh, wow, I'm really underperforming today.
Yeah.
Because it's like, I get light. Okay, I can make the weight class. Is it like this thing where you start big and then you end up really lean in a cut, and like people think that makes you really good?
Yeah, and it doesn't. It's just this. It's just this. It's people think they're getting an advantage by cutting weight. I can tell you for a matter of fact that the performance metrics, whenever you rehydrate, because I've done this testing, you do not go back up to anywhere as close to baseline. Yeah. And not only that, just think of your cardiac system, like dehydrating yourself to that degree. Think about the plasma volume loss, right? And you're going out there for 5 rounds or 3 rounds, and it's one of the most, cardiovascular demanding events. It's just there's so much misunderstanding, and there's just not been a rigorous scientific background behind some of this stuff. Now, obviously, guys like Andy Galpin, Andrew Usher, guys that are getting into the field and applying some science to this stuff, and the more there's, and that's what the big difference. Like we're talking about Russian science. Well, there's so much science on combat sports and Russian literature.
Mm-hmm.
Like probably 20% of the papers I see out there on some type of combat sports, because they understand so many factors that need to be kind of whittled down. But it's funny because we're talking about weight cutting and cycling. This is something that I've seen on several other podcasts. We're talking about weight cutting, and I'm like, you're in a sport that is probably one of the most isolated physiological sports there is, and you want to tell me that you're going to deplete yourself of nutrients, but you want to adapt physiologically? It's just such a hard thing to wrap my head around. Where it's like,
let's unpack that a little bit, because I think that's a super interesting point. Because I think what you're saying is like cycling depends so much on your actual fitness, whereas like MMA, not so much. Like MMA,
Exactly.
you can have a VO2 max of 80, or you could probably have a VO2 max of like 50, and you can fight about the same.
Yeah.
Sort of like in team sports, where it doesn't matter if you can squat more or if you can like do 20 razor curls. How well do you play soccer? That's the
Exactly.
big question. How's your team? How's your coach? How's your strategy? But yeah, I think that's super interesting, because that is a lot of the focus in competitive cycling today is just the physiology, the power, and I think there's one of the reasons I started the podcast is because I was having the same kind of questions that you do. Like before we started recording, I'd said that I think I'm your one YouTube view on one of your one of your things from your website.
Yeah.
From was it resilienchpc.ca,
Yeah.
right?
Yeah. Yeah.
And so I go under the individual training response, and I'm watching it, and I'm like, these are exactly the kind of things that I had, the kind of thoughts and questions that I had like years ago, and I started just questioning everything. Same as Tim Podlogar, who was on the podcast a couple episodes ago. He had the same thought, and you're in the same boat as us. So I consider you a kindred spirit, not only because we're both sitting next to all of our books, like you got a library behind you.
Yeah.
So what was your path between MMA and what do you do now, and like where are you at now? Because you coach and you work with a lot of different sports.
Yeah, I work with anyone I can get my hands on, really, because like I'm starting to work with some fighters again. I work with a couple hockey players, strength athletes, anything I can get my hands on. I really want to try and whittle down and ask the questions that I think are, I don't want to sound like I'm on a pedestal or anything, but I think there's just a lot of nuance out there that's being missed with some of these sports and approaches. So basically, I just want to figure out the pillars of, what are the differences in recovery processes for certain things? For example, like a sport like climbing, what are the recovery demands of training your tendons several times a day compared to training your muscle fiber a couple times per day? What are the demands of the sport is really a big question that I think everyone should start at. And when you start at that point, what are the demands of the sport? Then you'll start to find what are the good questions I should be asking. Because when you look at cycling, I think a lot of people don't start there. They just start from what are the best people doing? What is the guy down the road that's winning the local tournament? What is he doing? And then they start from this kind of reverse order. That's a very human
thing, isn't it, though?
Yeah.
I remember when I was like 13 and I was super into like Nirvana. I was like, I need Kurt Cobain's shirt. I need his jeans. I need his guitar, and I will be that guy. And then it turned out that I was glad I wasn't that guy.
Yeah, I hear you there. So, like with most sports, actually, the first point of demands is actually perception reaction, is vision, right? Vision is the first portion, which it's funny because I I can maybe count on my fingers how many people have even, thought about training their vision in MMA. It's starting to get more popular now in sport in general, just in health and wellness, but vision is basically everything. And I noticed the people that were always the best at any sport, team sport, they were just perceiving things quicker. Whether it's Wayne Gretzky in hockey, he was never the fastest skater. He was never the best at change of direction or hardest shot or whatever it is. It's his ability to see things better than the next guy. It's the same in fighting. If you watch what Mighty Mouse does, right, Demetrius Johnson, he's doing things on a speed that's so high. But if you think about it, why does he play video games for like 8 hours a day sometimes? Well, he's training his vision without even knowing it, and he's perceiving things quicker than the next guy. So really buckling down and realizing, okay, this is where we should start, is with vision, right? Training our vision, binocular, convergence, divergence, all these things. And then work out from there. What is the next step, right? Well, we want to have a good base of physiology. Well, what are the demands of the physiology? And then, strategy and all these things that get layered on top. And rate of perceived exertion is a big one. It's funny because I seen your post on Instagram, which I think is one of the funniest posts I've ever seen, of the cycle of RPE to, you know what I mean?
Heart rate to power back to RPE. Yeah.
Exactly. Right. And it's so funny because the wisdom I see in most sports actually work that way. Like, you start off relatively with the right answer, and then you try to like grasp for the next thing on the table, and then you come back and find it. But
yeah, well, that's oh man, it's so funny that I've had to I haven't had to, but I've had the opportunity to, I guess, explain to a lot of folks that no matter how much physiology you learn and you figure out how to apply, a lot of it is reinforcing the basics. Mm-hmm. Actually, I would say almost all of it is reinforcing the basics, and it's like remaking your entire training program to target this like one certain aspect of physiology is like getting the cart before the horse. It's but if you think, does this how does this help me in the training stuff? But like a lot of it is like, if you learn one thing, you are like taking a step out into the darkness, and then you think, and then you can turn around and go, I know the way back here. But as soon as you take a couple steps and you think you know the way back, all of a sudden you don't. And you've got like half of the puzzle and you don't know the missing pieces. But the more pieces you have, the more you see the gaps in the puzzle. And you can go, oh, I've almost got a map here, but there's still the fog of war between me and all these little pieces of physiology that are taunting me that I don't know yet.
Yeah, it's true. And I think like you get this with certain athletes, the people that like really stick to the internal perception, like they stick to the things that are important, which I think a lot of them is like internal perception, rather than this external focus. I don't know if you've seen this in cycling, maybe you could elaborate on this, but like the individuals that understand, they call it interoception and research, right? Like the ability, they start off with the ability to maybe detect your heart rate as one component that they would use in research for an athlete's ability to understand what's going on in their body. But interoception, basically the ability to understand some of these thresholds, some of these abilities to understand their effort. Like if you look, I was talking with Jem Arnold about this with like Speedgate Golf, where, these coaches would have, their runners go out, 10 or maybe 6 or 8 or whatever runners go out at the same time, and they're running 20 meters, but they have to time 20 meters at exactly 2.3 seconds. And the person that hits 2.3 seconds is the winner. So they're connecting their perceived exertion to their output, right? And this is something that I don't think a lot of sports really spend a lot of time thinking about, but realistically, this is a really good like kind of concept to carry over, because power is power. Power is a different thing on a different, we obviously know it's fairly stable. We know power is fairly stable.
Yeah.
But when we're talking about, riding for several days in a row, like in some of these bigger tournaments, power doesn't always equal power. What is your RPE is kind of an important, I don't know, maybe you can talk a little bit about this too. And
yeah, well, because you're getting to pacing.
Yeah.
And the pacing is a lot of what I try to work on with folks, especially if they don't have a really amazing natural ability at it. Like most people need to work on pacing. I need to work on pacing. A lot of my athletes need to work on pacing, and so what you're talking about with, like, being able to time 20 meters to 2.3 seconds, that's pacing. And
Hmm.
it's sort of like if you've got a flat time trial that's 20K, being able to pace yourself so that you explode on your very last pedal stroke across the line.
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
That's
Exactly.
good pacing, and so I think that's one of the things that carries over between sports, because I was watching the Spanish Grand Prix yesterday, and like the ability of those drivers to know their lap times, to like be able to
Hmm.
feel the pace and be like, I've got a little more pace, or like I need to back this off, and they'll do it within like a half a second a lap or a second a lap, and
Hmm.
that's absolutely mind blowing to me. And then you can get a fresh set of tires on and then go a full second a lap faster your first time out without having like practiced. Oh, I can take this corner a little faster. Like they can feel the car, and that's kind of like an RPE in sports and in cycling, especially, is how I think about it. Obviously, where if you are well, obviously the RPE thing too is fascinating, because I want to do a podcast on this soon. But having set points for RPE is actually super important, I think, to start
Hmm.
with. Like having a common language of RPE between you and your athlete. And it doesn't ever have to be the same between people. I know other coaches
Yeah.
use different set points on the scale of 1 to 10 than I do. Where like I think like a 6 is threshold for some folks, but like a 7 is threshold for me. And we
Hmm.
have just different ways of describing it, but we're all trying to get to the same point. And so when you start thinking about RPE, it's sort of like we needed how we needed a way to describe the boiling and freezing points of water,
Yeah,
or like
that's
just
true.
temperature in general, right?
Yeah.
So like we use water, like, and why do we have 32 Fahrenheit instead of 0? It's because some scientists back in the day decided to make a brine of like ammonia and different salts and try to make a liquid that had the lowest freezing point he could find.
Yeah.
So
Yeah. It's true.
then of course we have like feet, and are the less used version of feet, which is hooves. We have the hooves and thumbs.
Yeah. Yeah, it's a good point, and I don't want to rehash what I've already talked about online, but like in that discussion too, we were talking about like how can we practice that in several different aspects. And I always, anyone I have in the gym, I explain to them this is a great opportunity to work on RPE. So whether you're doing an isometric, let's just say I have an athlete say I want you to do single leg bent knee calf raises to 15 reps to failure. Pick a weight, whatever weight. You might be able to do 30 reps, but I want you to fail on the 15th rep.
Mm-hmm.
So I want you to modulate your effort to hit 15 and fail. Maybe it's adding more co-contraction, or the same thing with an isometric. Um, you know, modulate your effort to fail at 30 seconds. And the more you get these reps in, and obviously not all your weight training is going to be centered around that, but use some of those opportunities where you're building different capacities in the weight room to take advantage of understanding that connection in your brain. Because you ask an athlete to go out and sprint for 50 seconds, you tell them 50 seconds, it's going to be a different sprint than if you say 10 seconds, right?
Yeah, very.
So I think it's just, some of these internal processes that if you spend a lot of time trying to develop, especially in a sport like cycling or running endurance sports, you'll gain quite a bit in understanding. Oh, I can hammer on right now for sure. I can, yeah.
Yeah. And in cycling, it's a little different than a lot of other sports too, in that we actually are using like different energy systems like over and over and at different times and repeatedly even.
Yeah.
And so it becomes extremely different to like pace. Like if you are solo off the front in a criterium, you've got to accelerate out of every corner. And that becomes very different than putting out a really steady out and back like 40K TT,
Yeah.
even if you do it for the
Yeah.
same amount of time. Um, and it can require different training. It can require different practice. It can require different sessions. I'm saying can because it doesn't always. Some people can do either way, and a lot of it comes down to like technique and all that kind of stuff. And so, and then of course being able to adjust your effort for how tired are you on the day. Because Joe Martin's stage race just finished up yesterday, and that last race, and even the time trial on the second to last day, it's very different than if you do the same time trial without having raced 2 road races 2 previous days. And so adding all those factors can help. But the most important, of course, is making sure that you have your best effort on that day, regardless of all the other things, because you should be able to adjust your effort based on your RPE to that day.
Yeah. Yeah, it's like that's the difficulty of sport, is because you spend so much time, for this one little moment to express whatever you're trying to express.
Yeah.
And I think a lot of people don't realize that there is going to be, you can train all these capacities and qualities, but there's still this thing on the day where you're still going to have to modulate. You don't go out there and just blow out the lines, right? You have to still modulate, and
the old Italian tune-up.
yeah. So it's it's a good thought. And like while we're on this, I wanted to think of because we were talking a little bit there about training in the weight room. Like when you approach cycling and connecting that to the weight room, obviously there's not a ton of research out there, right, on connecting cycling. I just actually read a review the other day on Ronstadt, was difference in sexes between men and women and weight training and cycling. And but there's just not a ton of literature out there on the connections between cycling. What is it that you like? What is the conversation you're having with an athlete whenever you're saying, "Hey, do you think it would be beneficial for you to be in the weight room?" Like, what are the qualities that you're trying to grasp when you're in there? What are you trying to get out of that for athletes?
Usually it's why are we in there? For older athletes, like 40, 50 plus, usually it's for health, just to make sure that if you do crash in a crit, that you don't break your hip wide open and, need a replacement, or, need to spend 6 months healing or whatever it is. But the other thing is, is a lot of folks, I think, see some of the research out there that says if you do some weight training, you will increase power at blah, blah, blah. And a lot of it is just straight up from like neural drive. It's just really simple, basic. Your brain gets used to putting out more signal to contract larger motor units, or contract, say, motor units faster or something like that. And then, that gets us into the questions of like sprinting and like, why are we doing this? What kind of power do you want? And for a lot of folks that go into the gym, first of all, some people just like it, and that's okay. I just like it too. But when it really comes down to it, if somebody wants to like improve their sprint, the first thing we have to do is think about the training that is going to take away from being on the bike, and thinking about long-term limiters, because what limits somebody in a bike race that's longer than about a minute is mostly going to be aerobic. And so if you are trying to get to the end of a criterium and have a great sprint, like if you get to the end of a crit and like fresh, you've got like 1500 watts, and at the end of a crit, you've got like 1100, and you want more at the end of a crit, you don't need to hit the weight room. It's like the criteria is too narrow. It's like, I'm not sprinting hard enough, therefore I need to train my sprint better. It's backwards. I'm not sprinting hard enough at the end of a crit. I'm too tired. I have depleted myself. I need to get aerobically stronger. Because if you look at a crit, like the power surges like over threshold, but if you're surging at like 350 watts over and over again, and your threshold's 300 watts, that is a very hard day. If your threshold is 380 watts, surging at 300 or 350, that's nothing. absolutely nothing,
Yeah.
and you are going to get to the end of your race, and you're going to maybe be down like 50 watts. So,
Yeah.
and then that gets into like pacing and saving energy in the group and reading the race and all that kind of stuff. So the weight stuff, it's hyper contextual.
Yeah.
I
For
I
sure.
wish there were an easy answer.
No, no. That is a good answer because I think a lot of people miss that, you need balance in whatever sport you're doing, especially when you have this whole life load outside of sport, right? But if you look at even professional athletes in many different countries, a lot of them on their off seasons would play other sports quite competitively
Yeah.
to the point where they're like almost at a professional level at other sports, right? To find balance and qualities outside their sport. And I think that a lot of people are chasing the wrong things in the gym sometimes, and there's actually better applications of what they could be doing to get where they want to go, but they're chasing the wrong things. They're not getting exactly what they think they're getting, I think,
Yeah.
rather than just understanding that this is just like a balance mechanism. You need balance
Hmm.
in whatever sport you're doing, right? Because
Yeah.
if you're sitting down at a computer for 8 hours a day, going out and sitting on a bike, right, you're going to need some more balance outside of that to
Hmm.
try and gain homeostasis in the long run, right?
Yeah. Well, and also I think going back to the research on weight training and cycling, in the what research there is, a lot of it has cyclists that have never been in the weight room before.
Yeah, of course. Yeah.
And
Yeah.
there's a lot of like noob gains to be had that I think color a lot of studies. And this is one of the things that I think that you were mentioning in in your video that I was watching, and I was like, man, this guy's right on. He's got it's the same question I was asking, because you're thinking about the test group, you're thinking about where they are in training, and like the subtext to that is like when somebody is new at something and they just start doing it, there's a very, very rapid improvement in ability in a very short amount of time.
Yeah.
And the same thing goes in like aerobic stuff too. Like the first thing that we usually do is gain plasma volume, and that increases VO2 max, and that increases threshold. It's pretty simple. But once, and so like, and you can get there by doing endurance riding. You can get
Yeah.
there by doing threshold work. You can get there by doing VO2 max and high intensity stuff. And the questions start piling up about like, what is the mechanism that makes this yield this adaptation?
Yeah.
And so the mechanism that helps us when we are new at something is not the same one that helps us when we are well trained and we're looking for like another 10 watts of threshold per year,
Yeah.
if that. Or sometimes it's like, okay, this person doesn't have any more threshold to gain. Let's see if we can get them more endurance, or let's see if we can work on their sprint, or see if we can work on their reading the race, or anything like that. And so as you go, the studies get a little bit less applicable as you
Yeah.
get further and further into being a very well trained athlete,
Yeah.
because that's where I think the science is only can inform like 30 to 40% of what you're doing.
Yeah.
And I see, by the way, I see on your page, I see a very large amount of equipment that you have,
Yeah.
like infrared thermal imaging, spirometry, metabolic analyzer, pressure mapping, lactate
Yeah.
stuff, et cetera, et cetera. Like you
Yeah.
have a ton of stuff that in cycling we don't, because you work with so many different sports. And what I want to know from you is, how well does that stuff translate
Gains.
into gains, yeah, in other sports?
Yeah.
But also is it sort of like in cycling where there's very little, like without power meters we would have very little to measure baseline fitness with, other than like how well can you climb this hill, or how
Yeah.
fast can you go over this course? But there are so many different factors. So when you've got all this equipment and you're testing athletes and you're training them, how much is it like, how much is it where this equipment is super useful, or how much of it is just getting a sense of what somebody needs to train, and then regardless of how they perform on that test later, you can see that they're better because of the training. Like how does that balance work
Yeah.
with you and with other sports?
Well, I think it's funny because this is one of the questions I had for later too, is understanding, like, we're talking about softwares and stuff like that, but so this stuff does, just right off the bat, I'll go ahead and say it increases buy-in, because it's an objective thing that an athlete can see and say, hey, I'm not just, it's not just me telling you that you need this, or this is this thing here is showing you that there's probably a potential area to be, you know, down the rabbit hole with when it comes in regards to this metric that we're talking about. Whether it's applying pressure into the ground when you're walking, that is going to transfer to pretty much everything else. It's something very simple, but also just like some of the testings with coordination and balance on a pressure map. If you go out and I ask you to march with your eyes closed or step on the mat with your eyes closed, and you're doing a 180-degree rotation, your brain, the sensory information from your feet is obviously off.
Yeah.
There's probably something there to be gained, and understanding, like, whenever you hit the ground when you're running, your brain actually is probably sending some, like, essentially information that is not going to benefit you in the best way. So can we pull that apart and try and understand, how can we improve that sensory information starting at the feet up?
Mm-hmm.
Maybe it's something as simple as textile insole, right? It could be something as simple as changing the surface that you're doing some of your exercises on, right? It's the same thing if I told you to go out and do something with very fine motor skills, like play guitar with a glove on. What's that sensory information, right?
I used
What's
to play
that
guitar, and that would be
Yeah,
awful. Yeah, even a light touch
exactly.
glove, I would hate it.
You don't know what's going, you don't know what's going on there.
Yeah.
So some of these things, yeah, it's first and foremost, it's like, it's just going to give another objective voice to the athlete that's saying, hey, this is something. And it can, for example, make a huge difference too. Like, I had an athlete come in with a 7-liter lung capacity.
Wow.
Right? And
Yeah.
he's a small guy. He's not some 6'9" rower, right? He's a runner. And off of some of the popular sci that he was out there reading, like Breathe and all these other books, I think, he kind of had misconstrued maybe some of the type of breathing that would be beneficial to him. But we're saying, no, like, you have this massive lung capacity. Let's try and see if we can organize your breathing in a better way so you're not hyperventilating. So, you're getting good coordination of your breath. It's just kind of a little bit of a shortcut. Sometimes you find a shortcut with it. Sometimes you don't.
Yeah.
Right? Sometimes an athlete comes in, hey, I gave blood and my arm's like all messed up. Well, let's throw the thermal camera on and see what's going on there. And maybe it's a little bit of a shortcut so we can pinpoint it. It's just,
I have a question about that. Is like, I mean, when you say it increases buy-in, in a way, that sounds to me like it increases the effectiveness of how you can assess an athlete.
Yeah, exactly. Because a lot of these things, for example, I could probably do some of these things with my eyes. Let's say, for example, with a powerlifting athlete, right? I want to understand the technical proficiency versus the actual strength that athlete has, right? The squat to me is not a good predictor of strength in the legs. Mm-hmm. There is so much coordination going on there, and I'm not trying to throw powerlifters under the bus. I did it for a long time too. So I'm just trying to say that it's not the best predictor of raw tissue capacity, right?
Yeah.
What is the capacity of that tissue? So maybe I put them in a belt squat and connect it to a crane scale, and then throw a moxie on there and see what's actually going on at the muscle, because that's so simple. Like, the more complex you make a movement, the less of an ability for the athlete to actually send input into that, right?
Yeah, you're removing components of the kinetic chain, which
Exactly.
everything that we put in increases losses, which is, among other things, one of the reasons that, if we did like a bench press, if we took the bench away from the shoulders, the bench press would be less than half of what it is.
Exactly.
I went on the leg press because somebody had taken the squat racks or the trap bar or something a couple weeks ago, and like, I didn't realize how much I could leg press because I had been squatting.
Yeah.
And I messed my quads up. I was just like, oh my god, yeah, I could do this for like I could do 10 more reps if I wanted to, but I should stop
Yeah.
here. And then like I'm shaking and my quads were like quivering for a couple days afterwards. I was like, oh wow, or as you might say, the capacity of this tissue is high,
Exactly.
higher than I might have otherwise realized. But
Exactly.
that's one of those things that I learned on myself, that we have to be careful with that kind of stuff. And I think that it's cool in a way that you get to use so much equipment, because in cycling we've got a power meter and maybe a lactate thing, and that's going to be about it.
Yeah.
There's not a lot of other stuff that really helps us, unless you're going to like get into like bike fitting and biomechanics and that kind of stuff.
Yeah.
There's
Yeah.
really nothing else. That
Yeah.
a lot of it's just understanding what is the limitation of this aspect of your performance.
Yeah. Yeah. And the thing with that too is with endurance athletes, the training load and time is already so high.
Yeah.
Right. So I look at all training as is when we're making changes in training, I look at it under two categories. Is it a substitution or is it an addition? Right? If I have to add something to the process for the athlete, that is putting extra time demands, extra stress demands, right? Versus, can I just simply change something that they're already doing
Yeah.
and takes no extra effort, and it'll get a, slightly higher yield and adaptation? And I think that's where, endurance athletes are already kind of limited in that realm because they're already training 10 plus hours a week, right? Whereas with
Yeah.
powerlifting athletes or whatever it is, some of these team sport athletes, it's a little bit less, and they might have different time schedules. If you're a team sport athlete, and you're 25 or 35 years old, you're probably professional, or you know what I mean? So it's
Yeah.
a different kind of thing where a lot of professional individuals do these recreational sports, which is it's a totally different thing, right?
Yeah, no, I think that's a really interesting observation, because that puts into words something that I've known sort of about endurance athletes, which is just the limited time and the limited ability to train and recover. The recovery is a big one, because if you've got a full time job and you're training like 10, 15 hours a week on the bike, if you try to go to the gym on top of all that, suddenly you are very, very stretched thin. And it's not like the physical load, because if you're, if you're a professional athlete and you've got all day to just do this stuff, you can wake up in the morning, have a leisurely breakfast, go ride, chill out for a couple hours, like take a nap, get an extra lunch, walk the dog. Then you go to the gym in the afternoon for an abbreviated session, and then you can do something else the next day. But if you've got work and like travel and family stress and all that kind of stuff on top of that, suddenly, that it adds up. Like that level of stress on the body adds up. It's almost like training without turning a pedal.
Yeah, it's a totally different story, and that's like if you're going to add something, you should be very certain that it is going to yield a very high benefit. Like if you're substituting, it's kind of like, yeah, let's play around a little bit. Let's try and figure out what works for you. But talking about recovery is, I think 90% of people's effort should be into, we think we have a lot of things understood with recovery, but there's just a lot of stuff out there that I don't see folks experience. Like, for example, the reason why I've always been really into recovery is whenever I first started training, there was an individual I followed up here in Canada. He works with a lot of individuals, and he's out there. He's out there, but he's actually got the education of someone that I would consider like a doctoral degree, right? Like, this guy's a fairly well-read individual, and he talked about something called working in. And, I took that into pretty much everything I did, and understanding every time, and it transformed. First, it was this understanding that if you're consistently just working out and expelling energy and you're not gaining energy back in, I know this sounds like ethereal here and esoteric, but
I mean,
what I'm
it sounds
talking
like
about
eating
is
enough.
just exactly, basically what I'm talking about, what it evolved to was autonomic nervous system state, right? But what it was is if you're constantly in the sympathetic state, I was looking for ways to find these micro rests in everything I did. So instead of like pounding music after, my set of 5 deadlifts of whatever weight, I would sit there, tune in, and basically try and find stillness, and whatever terms you want to find that, so I can get this micro recovery. And then it turned into the ability to shift states from going from a fairly low arousal, a parasympathetic, to a very high arousal really quickly, and then shifting back. And the better you get at that, you're stealing more recovery time. And I found my recovery went through the roof with this stuff. And even I started experimenting with like TENS, transcutaneous electrical nerve stimulation, through the essentially the auricular nerve for vagal stimulation. So trying to increase vagal tone through putting TENS on basically on your earlobe and on your neck, essentially, to like increase parasympathetic stuff after work, and just everything down the box. And like there were some things I found really good gains from, but nothing, I don't think, just in my own biased opinion, lived up to the ability to control those nervous system states. It's the same with cycling, and I take it into everything I do now, or running, or anything. If you're doing an endurance sport, is finding some of these micro rests. And I'm like, whether it's trying to get my heart rate down and just manipulating my heart rate throughout the run or whatever, or just trying to understand that, not everything is just hammering down and stressing your body. That's not like the path to getting more reps in, right?
Yeah.
It's not.
Well, that's exactly what I tell people about recovery and rest, is that 98% of it comes from eating and sleeping. And then we have a very big asterisk for stress. And like, if you are stressed constantly and your sleep is suffering, and you are like, at to some degree in that sympathetic state all day because of job stress or life stress or whatever's happening, that affects your recovery so much. And, even in young athletes, even older athletes who are more experienced, and you would think, oh, he's got massive training base, like he shouldn't be able to be affected that much by this. Oh yes, absolutely. You can be that affected. Like, I've seen it affect 100%. People's basically effective FTP by like 30 or 40 watts or more. And depending on how stressed they are, and you'll see a massive drop in like peak power if they go do a sprint or something like that. And so it's because that all tracks with that like in between level of stress. And I actually have inadvertently found myself doing that. I used to go to the gym with headphones on, and I would just like blast metal and rock out for like 2 hours. And now I don't do that anymore, because I would always get to a point where I had to like turn the music down. And I was like, okay, I'm done being stimulated.
Yeah, exactly.
Gotta pull it back.
Yeah.
But it's sort of like, but along the same lines, it's like, I cannot watch a TV show or a movie when I'm on the trainer that has those ups and downs in mood, because my mood will follow those. Like, so that's like that scene, that big energetic scene with the explosions is over and they're in the office talking now. Like my power drops. I'm just like, even I'm just riding endurance. It's just like, I don't feel like training anymore. I'm done riding.
Yeah. Yeah.
So yeah, I think that's fascinating, man.
Yeah. It's and I mean, this is when you look at why athletes dope and take PEDs,
a lot of it's for recovery,
yeah, a lot of it's for the recovery, like especially sports outside of endurance. Like, that's why people take steroids. It's because they're trying to enhance their recovery.
Yeah,
they want to, and I think just it's a very simple thing, and it's funny because like the more experience you get in life is, your answers become more basic and your answers become more cliche, but it takes you a long time to get there, and the real ability is being able to try and portray that onto someone else's perception of what they think is going to make them better too. Like, as a coach, that's what you're trying to do, is, instill that hard-earned wisdom. That's why I love books. To me, books are the most insane thing ever. Like, people have spent their entire lives trying to figure out this one thing, and they're going to give it to you for $20.
That's a great way to think about it.
It just doesn't make sense to me, right? It's the same with you. Like, all the stuff that you put out there, and I'll go out there and say it right now for sure. It's like you have one of the best podcasts in exercise science, period, not even just in cycling,
That is really
because you're
flattering.
putting so much effort. And that's the big thing you see with the guys that are, like, for example, like Einstein, these guys. And it's something I noticed when I was a kid. It's
Do not
not
compare
like,
me to Einstein. Oh my god.
no, no, I'm just throwing it out there. The individual that ends up giving the most benefit back is the person that just cares the most, right? It's the same thing with coaching. Like if you look at Charlie Francis, one of the reasons he was such a good sprinting coach was because he cared so much about his athletes,
Yeah.
right? He cared so much about giving the correct information. The same with you and your podcast. Like you can tell you put a lot of preparation into trying to give the best information possible to the individual because you don't want to mislead anyone in any wrong direction. Where other coaches can sometimes be a little bit intellectually lazy and just say things. And it's different with you. I can even tell by the way you speak. You're very careful on how you portray things, and that goes a long way in the long run because as an athlete, a lot of it is just you spend so much time going around down these wrong directions. It's, the people that get there the quickest is a lot of the times who have a really good figure to guide them and prevent them from going down too many wrong directions. And they get there a little bit quicker than the next guy, right?
Yeah. Well, I mean, I've had some really great mentors in school and also just in cycling and in science in general. Like I remember once Tim Cusick pointed out to me how careful Andy Coggan was with his language. Like whenever he would post somewhere or like speak somewhere or write something, the language is always extremely, extremely careful. And that's one of those things where I think that, this podcast isn't nearly as popular as it could be if I tried to like simplify stuff and like just do this. And this
Exactly.
is, your miracle intervals right here.
Yeah.
And we all know, here in the real world, there's no such thing. And that a
Yeah.
lot of that kind of stuff comes down to like data manipulation and all that kind of stuff. And that, a study, may come to some conclusion, but, you and me, we read that study and we'll go, I don't think that's true at all. Like,
Yeah.
because we're like trying to put together a lot of stuff, a lot of information into the same thing and explain a phenomenon that I think the very basic thing that I always try to think about is, does this match your experience? Does this match those thoughts you have about like, is my FTP set too high? Maybe I remember, and back in the day, I remember like doing FTP intervals. I was,
Yeah.
my coach was giving me like 3x15, then 4x15, and that was pretty much what I got. 4x15 minutes, zone 4. There you go, 5-minute rests. I can do that. And I just wasn't getting faster, and I was like, there's got to be something else to this. But he's the coach; he must know everything. He must know the best. And I would even assume that he knew like my recovery rate and how I felt and all that kind of stuff, and I would just like trust it blindly. But I've learned from that kind of stuff in such a way that I'm always asking my athletes, how are you feeling? Like I want to see that RPE rating in Training Peaks. I want you to describe how your legs felt, and whenever I describe, like to go back to the IPE thing, I will describe what a 7 should feel like. I will describe what this 8 should feel like. I will describe what this sprint should feel like or how I might pace it. Like, if it's a minute max effort, how I would do it is I would start by in the drops out of the saddle into the bottom of the hill. I would start at like 80% of a full sprint, and I would just maintain that effort until I had to really like concentrate on maintaining that effort. Then I would sit and just grit my teeth and close my eyes and think of England. And I will write that. Like I don't usually copy paste workouts and anything for anybody. So I actually write by hand every workout every week, except for like lifting. I can copy paste and make some small adjustments. That one's pretty easy, but
Yeah.
otherwise, it's very individualized in what I think this person needs to work on. And, if they had a similar workout last week, we'll go, oh, I think you need to work on this. We'll modify the workout, add some notes, et cetera, et cetera. So I think, the caring about people thing is also just recognizing that everything is super individual with people.
Yeah.
And that everybody needs a little bit something different. And like some of the biggest mistakes I've ever had in coaching is besides violating some big rule because somebody says they're fine, and I should not believe them when they say that they're fine. I'm looking at their training load, going,
Red
"You need
flag.
rest." And they're like, "I can keep going." No, no, I'm going to stop you right here. You've been training
Yeah, yeah,
for 10 months straight and racing, and you have felt
yeah,
fine the whole time. But there's more to your fitness, but you need a rest first.
yeah,
Um,
yeah.
and
Go
I
ahead.
was actually going to ask you because I sent you that webinar from Dean Golich.
Yeah.
What did you think about that? The one on performance
That
modeling.
that that dude is he's got some early wisdom, I would say. Like he, especially with all the different sports that he's worked with, right? This is something that I see in very few individuals, because there's not a lot of individuals that really venture out into these different, because it takes so much time. No one has time for that anymore, to try and understand the demands of like hockey versus, like motorsports, right? Like who has the time for that? But he obviously over the years has found time. Maybe that's why you don't see him on like Twitter, what
He's
you're saying.
busy.
He's probably just like stuck in the dungeon somewhere trying to figure out the demands of some new sport. But it's funny because I really took from, he was talking about using some of the processes that militaries use, and anywhere he could get anything. And that's what I really think is, I call them gamers, people that will like, basically they hold no ego. They just go in and get what they can from things. Like that's the big thing I see with individuals, that whether it's they're an athlete or a coach, that they have the humility to understand that, hey, I could probably learn something from a power lifter, right? As an endurance athlete, there's like, there's nothing I could learn from this guy,
Yeah.
right? And vice versa, like a strength sport athlete, like an Olympic lifter, what can I learn from an endurance sport athlete or endurance coach?
Yeah.
And just having the humility to understand that all these sports and endeavors have spent decades trying to figure out these physiological processes that gain adaptation. And you might find something there, and you might not even from the physiological side, but just from the process side
Yeah.
of training and managing an athlete. It was really good to hear that, because you just don't see that a lot in sports. I find everything's going this, specificity route of everyone has to be hyper specialized, and kids have to be hyper specialized in everything they do. And it's easy now because there's so much information out there to hyper focus on these little things.
Yeah.
But I thought it was good because he was talking about like understanding the error measurements and whatever you're doing,
Yeah.
understanding, the actual percent gain that you're going to get in a year. And even if you add those up, where does that leave you?
Yeah.
Right. Those things are super important. And just getting those little because it transfers over to someone like, remember I brought up Dan John
Yeah.
when we were doing that talk there, our last conversation. That's the same type of individual. No one listens to Dan John because he just says very basic things. But he actually, if you listen to what he's saying, he's giving you this, it's insanely a complex way that he's got there, right? Like if you listen to how he tries to approach winning the track meet with his team that is actually less physiologically capable than the next team, if you listen to how he tries to go about that process, you learn a lot from that. And he's kind of said the same thing that Golich talks about. It's like, show up every day, do this 3 times a week, and 10 years later, you'll probably get there if you're consistent, right?
Yeah.
And yeah, it's just these little things. Like with an athlete, it's just staying on top of the little things. Like how much time do you spend every year being sick?
That's a
Is
good
that
one.
can we just go get a $12 bottle of vitamin D? We know that athletes are going to deplete their vitamin D stores quicker than the most average individuals anyways. And even soccer players in Brazil are deficient, that are spending hours outside every day. Like there's just little things. I think, like, yeah, is vitamin D going to improve your performance on a time trial? No, but does it mean that you can't use it to try and enhance the overall process of gaining 2% a year or whatever it is? I just think that there's these little things that if you're just very consistent, that don't take really any addition, and you think about the long-term process, rather than this just short-term gain. If you always keep in the back of your mind the long-term process,
Yeah.
like just tattoo it somewhere on your hand or on your, on your bike handlebars, wherever, just a long-term process, right? Yeah, just that old school Russian stuff about developing the organism right, in the right direction with the right response and all the anyways, it's
That's funny
just
because I mean that reminds me that I've got it's like my very 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 long time ago, the very first person I ever started coaching, I did for nothing obviously, because I didn't know shit, and she sent me she would send me every couple months a gift, something, coffee or something like that. And one time she sent me a top cap. It's like this little green anodized thing, and it says on it pain. That's it. It's still on my bike. And I remember when I got it, it was like, God, it was like 2014 or something like that. She, like at the time, it meant a different thing to me then than it does now. Because at the time, I was very much in the mindset of you get out what you put into it. Like I didn't have any conception of genetics or anything like that. I remember I had a coach who said, like, me and one of my friends were being coached by him, and my friend goes, "Hey, how come I can't just like do FTP work for the next year and take my 330 watt FTP and turn it into 400?" And the coach goes, "Well, you would have to do a year of FTP work." And so that's all I thought was between me and a 400 watt FTP. Between my like 280 and like 380, I thought it was just going to be a year of FTP work. And then I realized that was not the case. And so now that little pain top cap, it's more ironic to me now than anything. I see it and I'm like, yeah, it's going to hurt sometimes, but most of the time I should make it not hurt. It's contextual and it's changed over the years for me like that. And I think that's, I don't know, an adorable anecdote, possibly.
yeah. We all get caught up in that too. Like whenever I consulted with you, I go through these cycles. It's like the song that never ends kind of thing, where it's like I go through these cycles of getting really excited about things, and then it takes me like 4 weeks to realize, or unless someone snaps me out of it, that yeah. Okay, we're back here. This is where we're at. This is just a thing. It's a shiny object, and you just got distracted for 2 minutes.
Yeah.
And I think that's just it is like I'm a younger guy, so the maturity level, it's still like I understand that it's going to take me some time to like for my initial instinct to just be like, whatever, But because I'm such a like trying to find, ever since I was a kid, I was like trying, like I thought I just had this secret because whenever I was a young teenager, I'd figured out PubMed. I figured out what Google Scholar was when I was like 14. So I thought I had this secret that all these other kids didn't have, and I was going to be like, I'm going to be a professional athlete in all these different sports, better than Bo Jackson. And all these things, and because I had the secret, right? And it's funny, that's never really left me, even though I've failed miserably at pretty much everything I've ever done. But it's just that excitement of discovery and exploration and trying to find all these little different rabbit holes. It's still gonna kick you, but you just have to, as you mature, you're going to be able to be more conservative in your view on everything.
Yeah.
Right?
Well, you've got that self-reflection in your methods. You've got that introspection, but not really introspection of, that like, woe is me kind of Sylvia Plath introspection, but like self-doubt introspection, like what here does not work? What's not being effective? How do I improve this for the next round of whatever's going on? And I think that's what I think is so interesting about your approach is that you work with so many different sports and you've got, so much equipment and you've got so much knowledge. And at the same time, you're like, how does this work? I'm not really sure. I should, I should reach out to some folks and I should do more reading and I should get more books. Same here. Except I have the fortune to only be into one sport really, which helps with my, specificity, but also when it comes to things like strength training and, other stuff, I have like probably half the knowledge you do or less, because I've been applying it to this one little thing. Like when it comes to plyometrics, I am absolutely clueless. I know that they're basically useless for cycling, with maybe some very few exceptions, especially for if you're like doing PT, they probably have some effect. But I don't know anything about PT, so I'm I'm in the dark with that kind of stuff too. So I think that kind of like that level of self-doubt is so helpful when it comes
Mm.
to just being able to learn. And I think because one of the things that you had mentioned that you wanted to maybe touch on here is like, what other stuff have I learned from, or like what other stuff
Yeah, yeah,
influences me. But
exactly.
I want to know the same
Yeah.
about you. Like, what non-sport stuff has been super helpful to you?
Oh, this is like, and it's funny because what I told you even before this, like whenever I sent you over some of these questions and stuff like that, I was like, oh, like shit, he wants to know my answers on these, and it's like I haven't, not I've think about them constantly all day,
Yeah.
right? But I don't formulate my thoughts. Um, I just a lot of that is just broad. It's kind of understanding that everything may work, but it's just the window of applicability. Like, for example, like in some of my reading on hormesis and studying in hormesis is understanding that hypergravity for mice is a great stressor that can aid in plenty of different adaptations that are going to serve that mice in longevity in the future.
Yeah.
But there's a specific time frame that hypergravity has to be applied, right? If it's too early, too late,
Yeah.
the adaptations are actually they're
Because you
awry
have to hit
and
it
they
at the
actually end
right
up
point in
causing
the
detriment.
developmental process. Yeah.
Exactly. So, I mean, it's just kind of an overarching is that there's so much to learn, but the context is so important for everything where, yes, this might be really important for this athlete to learn, but is it the appropriate time? Is it the right context? Is it applicable at this time in his life? And understanding, like, you know, for example, I'm sure there's plenty of athletes that you could give them a much better program that might gain adaptation, but their ability to adhere to that would be so low that
Yeah,
you
'cause
would
a lot
get
of them don't
nothing
have
out
the
of it.
time to write that much.
Exactly,
So,
right? The endurance,
yeah.
it's so simple. It's so simple. That's a huge factor. It's just the time.
Yeah.
They don't have the time. It's, I don't know. I think actually, if I could say this, this is actually something that I've learned because I've gone through so many different iterations of trying to get good at something, whether it's, climbing, skydiving, or, whether it's endurance sport or lift anything. You go into these groups and you realize that there's a lot of the dogma around it is just ego. And the real learners, this guy called Travis Haley. He runs this he's got like the sports science lab. If you go in there, it's just like this. He's got 360 like virtual reality where you go in there and eye tracking and biomechanics. And realistically, the guy is so far ahead of anyone else in the realm of like the shooting. It's just insane. But like I went and took his course, and the stuff he was talking about, nothing was about shooting.
Mm.
It was all about vision. It was all about biomechanics. It was all about cognitive processing. But everyone in that field has this huge thing to uphold where they're scared to talk about something like that because it might sound woo woo,
Yeah.
right? And I noticed that in any different individual sport that I've went into is the individuals that can cut away that stuff earlier, cut away that dogma earlier and just ask questions and challenge everything. Those individuals end up, getting a lot further, a lot quicker because they realize the things that actually move the needle.
Hmm.
And they're not just going out there and doing that workout so they can post it on Strava or whatever and it looks good rather than, hey, I'm going to go out and look like some geriatric folk engaging in physical activity for a couple of weeks because it's not appealing to most people. The things that move the needle. Anyways, yeah, I don't know. It's not a good answer, but it's just like kind of off the top of my head of what I think is yeah.
Yeah. Well,
What about you? Like
because I think
what's some
your thing is very much like my thing. My thing is much more in the reading, and you're much more in the doing. So
mm,
I pretty much ever since I went back to school in like 2007, I've been reading like various versions of like pop sci books. Like the very first one that I read that made me want to go back to school was How the Mind Works by Steven Pinker. And I
Yeah.
wanted to do neuroscience. And I just like straight up walked into the neuroscience department at BU and I was like, could I go to grad school? They were like, no, you have a degree in like music production. You are not going to grad school here. But if you had something that was like biology, so why don't you take some
Yeah.
courses and then we'll talk about grad school. So like take, go to night school for a year or two and, keep in touch with us. And I did. And I eventually didn't want to do that because I was exposed to so many more things because it had answered so many fundamental questions of like, when I eat an Oreo, why does it make me have energy or get fat? I understand that now.
Yeah.
And that was like a fundamental question I had growing up. But I kept reading books that had nothing to do with what I wanted to study, but it was like kind of tangential in a way. And, just taking classes and just reading books on like, oh God, if I look around, what do I have? Let's see. Of course, I've got Daniel's running formula. I've got
Nice.
I've got Neil Burt's Bike Fit. I have of course Comey's Strength, Power, and Sport, et cetera, et cetera. But I've also got like 2 biographies on Hans Krebs, and I've got books on sexual selection, and I've got books on developmental biology, and I've got books on developmental neuroscience and all sorts of stuff. And I'll just like read it. Sometimes I'll just crack it open and just browse. And other times I'll
Yeah.
read it cover to cover. And a lot of that kind of stuff has, if nothing else, has helped me figure out, the history of some of this stuff, but also
Yeah. Yeah.
like just very large, like you don't have to remember exactly which insect it is where the males hatch early and impregnate the females before they're even hatched out of the whole cocoon womb thing. It's like that, like some weirdly weird like thing, but is it going to help me in cycling? No, but is it a cool fact? Yes. But did I learn other stuff in that book that, has helped at least formulate a thought process? Yeah, sure.
Yeah.
And I think that's, that the reading widely, and, occasionally you find a road back to where you started and what you're actually working on. And I think that's the coolest thing in the world. And I never know what it's going to be, but once in a while I'm like, oh yeah, I know this thing from like developmental biology, like from, jerboas and how their feet develop and how they walk. That's vaguely informative on pedal strokes and all that kind of stuff.
Yeah.
And sometimes it just means don't fiddle with what's not broke. But other times it means this is definitely a problem. You need to see a bike fitter.
Yeah.
So
Yeah.
it's, so I don't have a good answer either, really, other than just
No,
reading widely.
that was a good answer because I think you approach it in 2 different ways because when you talked about specialization and you hone in on this one thing, it's kind of like what Miyamoto Musashi talks about. Like when you do the way intimately, you see it broadly through all things, right? So you've honed in on cycling, and this is something that I actually have a problem with is just sticking to one thing for a long time. And Dean Gall, it's funny because I listened to a podcast with Dean Gallage and he said, and it's like, okay, I'm taking this. I have to like implement this now for sure. Is because he said if he has one regret is that he scattered his effort way too much when he was younger, rather than honing in on one thing, getting everything he could get out of that one thing, understanding it to the nth degree, and then moving on. Where I'm all over I got 7 things in the back of my head at all time that stresses me out.
Yeah.
And it's like for you, you've honed in on that one thing, but you also come to it from the other way and you go outside through all
Because
things.
I've also got
and
those
try to
7
find
things that
back
are stressing
home.
me out, but I only have one sport to worry about.
Yeah.
Yeah, and I mean, and that's funny because like it's really like a 2-pronged approach at this point for me, which is my experience with coaching and my experience learning and like in the academic more type stuff. And so I'm always trying to bridge the two. And there's not often where you really get a good link between, the scientific literature and how you should modify somebody's training plan. Because at the very least, it should it should jive with the basics. It shouldn't
Yeah.
make you think, oh, instead of this person, if this person can ride 20 hours a week, why aren't they most of the year? Oh, it's because I think the high intensity training is going to be much better for them because this one paper says so. I'm not going to do that because I know that volume is a huge component of aerobic fitness. And so I'm going to make the stuff I learn fit with what I know experientially. And that's really the empirical part about empirical cycling. It's not like empirical is not always about measurement. It's about, direct scientific observation. It's about, figuring out just what works and, the long process of why does this work?
Yeah, it's I noticed. Yeah, it's funny because we did like a podcast the other day on VO2 max intervals, how to train VO2 max. Sorry, we just kind of gave a brief overview of like some of the ways you would approach it from low intensity, and some of the ways you would approach it from the high intensity realm. We didn't talk too much about the middle, which you can. It's just like we just didn't have time. We were talking about the high intensity. I actually brought up, it's funny because I noticed it on your podcast first, which made me really go back and read that again. Because whenever I read that and RPE matched, it was the first thing I noticed when I read the title. As I started reading more and more and more, you tend to forget that the whole basis of that study was built around RPE. But I did notice it. It's funny because I took it into such account when I've read Seiler's other work, because a lot of Seiler's work with VO2 max was based around RPE. And yes, that's an important factor. Like RPE is an important factor for the stress load on the athlete, but it's when we're trying to hone in on something specifically, that's not, here I am. I should not be, telling him how to do research, but I'm just saying it's like I think there should have been more emphasis on understanding, hey, this whole research was based around this. Let's keep this in mind throughout if you would have kept reading that throughout the paper, it would have kept things in perspective, I think, a lot more for athletes going out there, right?
Yeah. Yeah. Well, because one of the things that I always try to do with papers is I look at the data first and I try to draw my own conclusions. I try to look at what was the protocol, what was the measurements done before and after, and then what was measured and what do I think about what happened. Then I go back and I read the author's interpretation.
Yeah.
And a lot of the time, I would say 50 to 75% of the time, I'm looking at the data and I'm going, I have no idea. I'll go right to the bottom of the paper and I'll read their conclusion, and then I'll go read the abstract too. And then I'll read the intro and I'll get some background and I'll be like, what exactly are they solving for? And honestly, like half the time or more, I'm like, I don't need this paper in my mind. This does not solve anything that I am interested in. I hope it solves something for somebody, but it's nothing that I think is useful at the moment. And I'll save it anyway. I've got a giant library of papers, but not a lot of them are like top of my mind of, oh yeah, this paper really changed the way that I think about something or other. Like David Montero and Carsten Lundby are two of the people whose papers consistently make me rethink everything that I'm thinking about. Because they really break down in a lot of ways that other folks don't. What are the components of, like, say, VO2 max? I think that's a really, really good one, because with VO2 max, we have several things that drive it. And a lot of people just look at VO2 max. It's sort of like looking at lactate in the blood. Like, there's rate of appearance, there's rate of disappearance. There's also what's going on in the muscles. There's several different places for it to go. There's several different places for it to come from. And so it's very contextual, and we need really precise measurements. And even those precise measurements, even with like tracer studies, are still open to interpretation, depending on what you think is happening in the cell. And so with VO2 max, Montero was one of his studies on something like early endurance gains are hematologically driven, or something like that for the title. And he basically gives people endurance training or whatever and he actually looks at plasma volume. He looks at red blood cell content. He looks at all sorts of like underlying physiological measurements to determine what is driving the VO2 max change, as opposed to just the VO2 max goes up. Because, historically, VO2 max is like the easiest marker for a lot of people to figure out somebody's aerobic fitness. But there's more under VO2 max than just that. There's like peripheral utilization. There's how much muscle mass are you using. There's, there's stroke volume limitations potentially. Like, and in the VO2 max series in the podcast, by the way, if anybody's listening, all the stuff before the Ronstadt episode really needs like double or triple the listens that it has, because that adds context to the Ronstadt episode, and why I came to those training recommendations, which, everybody wants to just be told what to do. I understand that. Again, that's why this podcast isn't that popular.
It should be though.
Thanks, man. But that's one of those things where, figuring out the components of the measurement is huge. And so it's like, I spent weeks, like Kyle and I recorded one of those podcasts like 2 or 3 times before I found the right study that explained exactly what I was trying to explain in the podcast in whatever episode. And it was the one on one leg versus 2 leg knee extensions. 1 leg knee extension, you could get up to 3 liters a minute, but there's a VO2 peak. It doesn't plateau for an increased workload. But you do 2 legs, suddenly you're at 4 liters a minute. And now you've got a central limitation rather than a peripheral limitation, which is pretty much what happens in all healthy individuals when we have sufficient muscle mass. So like the muscle mass drives the utilization aspect. And so then it becomes, where do you want to measure? It's like measuring voltage on a circuit board. Like you can put a ground here and you can put your lead here, and it's good. You're going to measure voltage or amperage or resistance at different in different amounts when you measure between 2 different points.
Yeah.
So anyway, that's the VO2 max example.
Well, what you said there, I think a lot of people won't realize that what you're saying is if research would have went that direction in the first place, we would have been a lot further ahead at, like, for example, like heat adaptation, right? Hypervolemia, the addition of more plasma and red blood cells over time, right? It's like 4 weeks when the RBCs start to increase. Additionally, those first 2 weeks of the plasma volume change, if we would have understood the components earlier, if we would have extrapolated those earlier, took away that earlier, we would have got to heat training a lot earlier than we did. We're just seeing it become popular now. Yeah. We're just hearing about heat training now to increase VO2 max, right? But if we would have broken things down, like you said, which these guys do a very good job of doing, if they would have broken down the components much earlier, we would have been there, because we probably had obviously, like even the paper that you sent me with the phlebotomizing of the athletes, right? And the VO2 max, like if people would have picked that out and said, this is what we're trying to get at here. What are the components, right? Because if you understand the components, then you can start understanding how to shift them. Yeah. In the proper direction. You would have understood that, heat is a good response to increasing hypervolemia, right?
But I mean, exercise physiology suffers, like cycling suffers from tradition, like a lot of sports. Yeah. It's like the unwritten rules of what's acceptable and not, and like what constitutes like an exercise domain or not, or what lactate is doing, blah blah blah, inflection point, and then that gets to like your test protocol. All this kind of stuff is it's really really it carries over for years, even when some folks very convincingly show that this thing is more complex. And all the data we have for X, Y, and Z might be wrong, like assigning interval training at different percentages of VO2 max. And every couple of years, a different group of scientists figures out that that's maybe not the right way to do it. Even though people have known since like the late 70s or early 80s that that's probably not the right way to do it, it's slowly growing. Sort of like exercise intensity domains. Like this is one of the biggest things that annoys me. It's like you don't have to hit VO2 max to like be in the severe intensity domain. Like that's like, some people will say like, that's like a physiological response and you need something physiological to explain blah, blah, blah. And I'm like, look, we can see it in the performance. We can see it in a power curve. Like that is like the most fundamental thing. Like there's a big shift in RPE. There's a big shift in a bunch of different things that we can measure. Who cares if you hit VO2 max or not?
Yeah. Measuring the wrong
Yeah.
thing sometimes. I think it's just these hyper focus on these certain metrics that kind of cloud people's judgment, especially like when you're looking at the training processes. Like, yeah, just take a look at any study. I think it's like I always do this thing when I was a kid and being like, always thinking like if there was an accident to be happen, I was going to be the one in it. You know what I
Yeah.
mean? So when I looked at training, when I started looking at training, I started looking at it in a different lens right from the get-go. Like I was looking at those 3 non-responders and saying that's probably me,
Yeah.
right? That could be me. Rather than looking, oh yeah, the mean average went up, right? I was looking at it from the perspective of, hey, this doesn't obviously, it's not a hard rule. I just think that a lot of that is lost with people understanding. They always want to think that they're going to be the exception. It's like, yeah, it's a good thing to keep in mind that the mean average moved
Yeah.
up, but it's not like this hard rule.
Yeah. I mean, in my last WKO5 webinar, that's one of the things that I I had is like it's like, look, you have to put a workout into the meat grinder of the athlete, and you've got to see what kind of sausage comes out the other side if you even get sausage.
The black box.
The black
Yeah.
box, and you know that's one of those interesting things where like sometimes I'll give somebody like heat adaptation training, and we'll see VO2 max go up, and sometimes it doesn't. You know, like right now it's like it's hot outside here. And so everybody's, whether they know it or not, they're probably getting a little VO2 max adaptation if they're not well trained. If they are well trained, now we've got to start thinking about other things to do. And like the heat adaptation will lead to this kind of stuff. And so like, again, it's one of those things where everything's very contextual.
Yeah.
But, you know,
Yeah, that's
oh
actually
yeah, sorry, go ahead.
that's actually a good question because this is one of the questions I had. Like, for example, when you're training for an event, or if you were to train for an event coming up in the next 6 months, what are some things that you would do that you know specifically you would never do with maybe all of your athletes, or maybe just a portion of your athletes? Like, what are some of the things that you would incorporate? Maybe it's something in the strength realm. Maybe it's something about your recovery. Maybe you do ice baths, even though you know that there's maybe something psychological that you'll get out of it. Maybe, you know what I mean? Just something that, you know, is there things out there that you do a little bit differently that you know that benefit you? Maybe not
Well,
the
so I
whole.
would be going for like a sprint competition, or I would be like doing a 1 kilometer time trial on the track. So I would go to a kilo, and I would the difference between what I would do with myself and what I would do with other people is I would try things that I am not sure if they would work. And it's one of those things where it would be something that I know would apply to everybody, or I would try to apply it to myself and figure out if that kind of thing would work for others. Like one of the things that I did last time I competed was like 2016, I think, in sprinting. And I think one of the things that I was doing was I was trying out when should we go for straight up the most power. And because in sprinting on the track, your cadence is very different, like in a match sprint or on the kilo. Like you're not always on the cadence that's going to make you produce the most power because you've only got one gear. So you cannot shift to make things more comfortable for yourself. So what I was doing was I was trying to figure out if I do these certain types of intervals for the most power, regardless of the cadence, does that still help me when I get on the track? And the answer was in a way, yes, and in a way, no, because of course it always depends. And so I figured out one of those things when we need to target specific cadences and when we don't need to. Like what kind of intervals is it just like go make the most power you can, like maybe get on the road bike? And what intervals is it like you need to be in this specific range or you need to like be on your track bike because something is a little different and this is what we need to target. So that's really the big difference there is like I'll experiment with things that I'm not sure if they'll work and I'll try to figure out like in what context they would work or not.
Yeah, that's super interesting. I think that's like the mind of it shows like your process and the way that it kind of connects to everything else that I see in you. Like you're going up on the cross first. I don't want to offend anyone in that statement, but that's kind of how I see it first, as you're sacrificing,
I'm the guinea pig.
possibly your own performance to try and understand the process more intimately for others,
Yeah,
right?
yeah. No, and I've been
Yeah.
doing that lately with just because I've been getting out on the bike more because the doctor gave me a heart all clear, like I'm good to go train again, and so I'm going out and riding and I'm like regaining my aerobic fitness very, very slowly, but I'm also relearning what it's like to have these different levels of fatigue and have this different recovery timeline from like strength training and sprinting. Strength training and sprinting, like
Mm-hmm.
I go to the gym and I do some heavy lifting. I'll come home and like my brain will just be like fried. Like my nervous system is like, what did you do to me?
Yeah.
My muscles are like,
Yeah.
I'm kind of hungry. you know,
Yeah.
it's very different
Yeah.
than like, climbing a hill for 30 minutes and coming home and being like, I am starving and I'm going to eat everything in the fridge. I don't care if it's good for me or not. And then like sitting down and being able to do
Yeah.
work, which I can sometimes do and sometimes not, depending on I I
Yeah.
completely missed for one of my guys this weekend. He raced on Saturday and I had my weekend wrong. And I was like, "Oh yeah, tomorrow look out for this, this, and the other thing." And he's like, "Tomorrow? You mean on my long endurance ride where I'm not racing? Are you okay?" So anyway, yeah. So
Yeah.
that's pretty much what I would do. But I'm actually curious about one of your questions for you, which is, what's your area of interest or passion outside of sports stuff? Because you do so much stuff. I don't know if you have something outside besides like, you know,
Oh, dude, it's all outside. It's sports is literally like the the thing that I kind. It's like kind of it's like a home for me. It's like I can always come back to it. Like I'll have, for example, I'll live with certain questions. It's actually relative to what we're talking about. So Abdullah Zina was an ultra endurance cyclist, and he went out and won two of these long self-supported races. I spent like 3 years with that question in the back of my head. You know what I mean? But I'm not focusing on sports. I'm focusing on other things. But a lot of the things in sports actually just sit in the back of my head. I'm not like actively focusing on them a lot of times. I'm always focusing on things outside of sports for the most part, whether that's like language. I just so many things. I'm always like, it sounds. I tell people like some of the stuff that I've done, and they're like, how, like, what is wrong with you? Like, why don't you ever just spend time doing one thing? I was super interested in, where do we get into it? Neurology, psychology, you know, anything that, even gardening, you know what I mean? Fishing, how fish respond to different colors in the water and how their vision is different. And it actually works in reverse. Like the murkier the water, certain colors they see better. It's just like anything. I'm just an avid learner. I love learning, and it's funny because like everyone has something really good to offer for the most part. That's something that I've always learned. Like when you're stuck. When I started in the military, you're stuck with certain individuals, in a trench for how many whatever days. You're doing some crappy exercise you don't want to be doing. You find that everyone has a lot to offer you, whether it's like maybe they're interested in hunting and you can learn a lot about the processes of how deer go through this cycle every year. Maybe it's not what you're into, but you can understand a lot about a certain creature and how they do these certain things and they have these certain ways of doing something. Let me just think like, yeah, like crime. I was into crime, organized crime for a long time, trying to understand how they built up these processes, to integrate with the supporting resources already in their towns and kind of integrate with the supporting structures already in their municipalities and things like that. Or xenoestrogens and how they affect, anything, development. I'm just like, I'm not ever connected to one thing for a long period of time, but I'm always trying to flip the page over. Like right now, I'm really into gait, understanding the gait cycle, like Bill Hartman stuff and expansion and compression. Actually, if you want to wrap your head around some crazy stuff, just go watch one of his videos and you'll be like, he's talking about helixes and how the cell and the individual move in the same patterns. It's just anything that, um, you know, people have something to offer, I'm interested in. So like that's why I love conversations, because if someone's interested in something, I'll always have an open ear to listen and learn from them, because I love hearing what people, have to say about whatever it is they're passionate about, because you'll learn something from it.
Yeah. So
I get
you're
hooked on it.
so in a way you're like we both kind of ignore Dean's advice on focusing on one thing for a little bit.
Exactly.
But at the same time, I think
Exactly.
it sounds like you and I both have like a main focus, and then we kind of nibble around the edges and kind of go, oh, this is
Yeah.
cool, or oh, this is cool. Like every time I listen to like the Steve
Yeah.
Magnus podcast, it's nothing that I've ever really thought about before, but I think by the end of the episode, I'm like, wow, I really learned something,
Yeah.
and I hope I can apply it to an
Yeah.
athlete someday or apply it well.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I think you have to, like, if you're a person like yourself that, is doing something so intensely, you have to have balance outside of that, right? You have to find kind of your learning through other means sometimes, or else you'll literally go mad. I think that's why those people go mad back in the old days. They'd sit in a dungeon with candlelight and read the same thing until they lose their mind.
The people who can,
Those are the people, they might have figured it out.
well,
but
I mean, the people who can really focus on something for years, I think are just incredible. Like,
yeah.
like old school, like mathematicians or scientists or whoever, like people who were like poor, people not from like high society, from the Enlightenment or anything, or the Renaissance or anything like that. Like, we're talking about, like, oh God, who's a good example? Leonard Euler, maybe, just like a guy who just didn't care about money, just like sat and did math all day, every day. And that's that. Those kinds of folks, I'm like, how do you do that? Because if I don't get a chance to like switch my brain off for at least a little while every day, like I pay the price after a couple days or a couple weeks.
Oh yeah. Yeah. What about you? Like right now, let's just say in the last couple months, what are some things that you've been kind of like exploring or honing in on or trying to understand more?
Oh, in physiology?
Anything, just anything.
Oh, I'm into watches. I love watches.
Really?
I would be
Cool.
into cars, but I don't have space for cars. I would get like a
fair.
a cheap little Miata, and like that's kind of
Yeah,
broken, and
yeah.
learn to fix it. But instead, for a while, I was taking apart and putting back together pocket watches, just to learn how they all work. And I didn't like have any education. I just like would like pick a couple pieces apart, put it back together, click the things, and just go, oh, how does this? And now I understand how a watch works. But I also have like an appreciation for high level manufacturing, like Rolex and Omega. I'm like, how do they make such precision instruments on such a mass scale? Or watches like David Tune, where it's like just hundreds of hours of a person like polishing this one tiny little thing to like a mirror shine. That kind of stuff fascinates me. And so it would be cars, but time and money. So it's watches instead, just something mechanical. I just like the mechanical stuff. And it's also one of those things where like you can get a cool watch for like a couple $100, and you can appreciate that it's a mechanical thing and it's not like digital. Cause I mean, everybody's got a pocket watch now. Your phone, you take it out of your pocket to look at the time. You have a pocket watch. Pocket watches are back. So they just don't operate like they used to. But I think about that kind of stuff sometimes. And once in a great while, it helps inform something I'm working on with like a research project or physiology. And I go, oh, that's kind of like this. So I'll ask like, the ML/AI guy. I'm like, hey, can we do this? Cause this is how this kind of like quartz movement operates. So can we do this to kind of like try to pull out some of this messy data? And he's like, actually, yeah, I think we could do that. Or, oh, it's not going to work because of this, that, and the other thing, but maybe we could do this instead. And so it kind of helps, but it's like anything else I'm into. And every once in a while you just find a watch that you look at it and you go, I have to have that. And I don't care about the movement. I don't care about anything else. Cause at the same time, like it's a trophy, it's like a car. I had a GT350 for a while and I love that car. Then Winters in Vermont made that car not so practical. And I sold it, and I made a slight profit, enough to pay for like tires and oil changes and stuff like that.
Nice. Nice.
because it was, what was it, 2021 or something like that, the big car shortage that we're still experiencing. So I was like, oh, I can get out of this for like even money.
Yeah.
Oh, cool. All right. I'll get something
Yeah.
practical again.
Yeah.
So yeah. Yeah. And yeah, little trophies, that you can appreciate for yourself. And once in a while, somebody will go, oh, hey, that's one of those, like the watch I'm wearing now is like one of those, like the watch guy watches. It's a Zin EZM 1.1, and it's fascinating to me. Like the case is like hardened steel. Like it's almost impossible to scratch. Like you can take a key and like scratch it, and it's going to do nothing.
Really?
It's super hard. And you can also time two events with it. I can do I can do the bezel. It's a countdown bezel, so I can time a crit, and then it's got a stopwatch on it, so I can actually time two events at the same time. Like I can time gaps between things, and
That's
so
pretty.
I mean, a phone would be so much better, but
Yeah, no, I totally understand.
I got lost in Instagram
That's,
on a
just
phone.
hearing you talk about it. Yeah, yeah, yeah. Hearing you talk about it, that's so interesting. Like, I don't know anything about watches, but even from the outside, just hearing you talk about it, understanding the components and the craftsmanship that goes
Yeah.
into it.
Oh, it's
so
it's
interesting.
fascinating. It's super fascinating. But not everybody's into watches, and that's fine. It's just that's just how I relax is that. And it used to be I would spend all my spare time with reading and researching and just focused. But after a while, I was just like, I cannot do this anymore. This amount of cognitive processing it's hurting me.
It's healthy. Yeah. Gonna die a few years younger,
Yeah.
probably.
Well, we're almost, damn, we're coming up on 2 hours.
Jeez,
But
yeah.
yeah, why don't we kind of take this plane in for a landing? So where can folks find you?
Yeah. I just came up on Twitter. I think I don't really use that much yet, but that's Matthew DeRoche. I think maybe. You'll find me there. if you look.
DESROCHES.
Yes, French, DeRoche. And then on Instagram, you can find me at Resilience HBC. You can find me on YouTube at the same handle. And then my website is the same thing, resilienchbc.ca.
Yeah.
I'm very new, so don't be jealous from my
Your massive following.
mass following instantly. It's just
No,
it's coming back and trying to
yeah,
build
no,
it up.
I think that you've got some good stuff out there already, and I think you're gonna keep putting out some really good stuff. And I'm gonna be watching it if nobody else is.
I appreciate that. It means a lot to me that you've even watched one. So.
Yeah, man. No,
Yeah.
it's super cool. And I was like, yeah, this. And our last conversation, I was like, we have a very similar mindset. We have slightly different focuses that overlap and don't overlap at some points. And yeah, I'm always like so fascinated to talk to you. And I got so many more questions I want to ask. So we'll have to do this again.
Yeah. Yeah, this was great. Same. Yeah, I feel the same way. It's like you touch on maybe two of the things, but it's good because it saves more for another
Yeah.
time. Yeah.
All right, man. Thanks for coming on.
Yeah. Thanks, Kolie.